Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern reality, a family drama unfolds that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. This is not a fairy tale of crowns and carriages, but a raw, human story of love, loyalty, betrayal, and the impossible choices that tear families apart. When duty clashes with devotion, when royal protocol meets personal pain, even the most powerful people in the world find themselves helpless. Sometimes the greatest palaces become the loneliest prisons, and sometimes the people we love most are the ones we must hurt the deepest. What you're about to discover is a story that reveals the hidden truth behind palace walls, a truth that would make headlines around the world and change the royal family forever. It's a story about a woman who gave everything for love, a man torn between crown and heart, and the moment when everything fell apart. This is the untold story of how one decision would echo through the halls of power, break hearts across nations, and prove that even royalty cannot escape the consequences of their choices. The morning fog hung thick over London as Camilla Parker Bowles sat in her private study at Clarence House, staring at the official letter that had arrived just an hour before. The royal seal seemed to mock her as she read the words again, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. After decades of standing by Charles through scandal, public hatred, and the long journey to acceptance, she never imagined it would come to this. The letter was formal, cold, and devastating. King Charles III had made his decision, and it was final. Her family would no longer be welcome at any royal residence. The Parker Bowles name would be quietly but permanently removed from all guest lists, all ceremonies, all royal occasions. Her children, her grandchildren, her brother, all of them were being cut away from her new life like unwanted branches from a royal tree. Camilla's hands trembled as she set the letter down. Outside, she could hear the sounds of London waking up, cars honking, people chattering, life going on as normal. But inside these walls, her world was crashing down around her. She had known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were two very different things. The problem had been building for months, though the seeds were planted years earlier. When Charles became king, everything changed. The responsibilities, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, it all intensified beyond anything they had experienced before. And with it came the palace advisors, the constitutional experts, and the cold reality of royal duty that left no room for personal feelings. Her family had always been different from the Windsors. The Parker Bowles clan was warm, loud, sometimes messy in the way that normal families are. They spoke their minds, laughed too loudly at dinner parties, and didn't always follow the strict protocols that governed royal life. For years, this had been overlooked, even charming in its own way. But now, with Charles wearing the crown, every action was magnified, every misstep analyzed, every breach of protocol turned into a potential constitutional crisis. The final straw had come 3 weeks earlier during a state dinner. Camilla's son Tom had made what he thought was a harmless joke about the French president's tie, not realizing that the microphones were still live and that his words would be broadcast across Europe. The diplomatic fallout was swift and brutal. The French ambassador had lodged a formal complaint, social media exploded with criticism, and the palace press office worked overtime to contain the damage. But it wasn't just Tom. Her daughter Laura had been photographed at a party where illegal substances were allegedly present, though she was completely innocent. Her brother Mark had written a memoir that contained a few too many colorful stories about Camilla's younger days. None of these things would have mattered in any other family, but they weren't any other family anymore. They were connected to the crown, and the crown had to be above reproach. Charles had tried to protect them, she knew that. She had seen him in heated discussions with his private secretary, watched him pace the length of his office as he argued with constitutional experts who spoke in cold, measured tones about maintaining the dignity of the crown and protecting the institution. But the pressure was immense, and it came from every direction. The Archbishop had expressed concerns. The Prime Minister had made subtle suggestions. Parliament was asking uncomfortable questions. The press was circling like vultures, ready to pounce on any new scandal. And through it all, Charles was trying to be both a husband and a king, two roles that seemed increasingly impossible to balance. Camilla understood the position he was in, but understanding didn't make the pain any less real. She thought about all the times her family had supported her through the difficult years. When the public hated her, when the press called her names, when Diana's death had made her the most unpopular woman in Britain, her family had stood by her. They had endured the hatred alongside her, shared the burden of being connected to one of the most controversial relationships in modern royal history. Tom had been just a teenager when the affair became public knowledge. He had faced bullying at school, cruel comments from strangers, and constant media attention that no child should have to endure. Laura had grown up in the shadow of one of the most famous scandals of the century, her teenage years marked by paparazzi photographs and tabloid stories that dissected every aspect of her mother's relationship. Mark had watched his sister be torn apart by the press, had seen her struggle with depression and anxiety as the weight of public opinion nearly crushed her spirit. The entire Parker Bowles family had paid a price for her love affair with Charles, and they had paid it willingly because family was everything to them. And now, when she finally had the power to protect them, when she was queen consort and should have been able to shield them from harm, she was being asked to cut them out of her life instead. The irony was bitter and sharp, like a knife twisted in an old wound. The morning sun began to break through the fog, casting long shadows across her study. Camilla stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where she and Charles had walked just yesterday, discussing their upcoming trip to Canada. Everything had seemed normal then. They had talked about the itinerary, about the speeches he would give, about the charities they would visit. There had been no hint that this letter was coming, no warning that her world was about to shatter. But she should have seen the signs. Charles had been distant lately, preoccupied in a way that went beyond his usual royal duties. He had been taking more private meetings, spending long hours with his advisors, and when she asked about his day, his answers had become shorter, more guarded. She had attributed it to the stress of being a new king, to the enormous responsibility that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. She never imagined he was planning this. The worst part was that she couldn't entirely blame him. She had lived in the royal world long enough to understand its brutal mathematics. One scandal could damage the monarchy for generations. One misstep could undermine everything Charles was trying to build as king. The institution was more important than any individual, more important than any family, more important than love itself. But knowing this intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things entirely. She had spent decades learning to put duty before desire, to sacrifice personal happiness for public perception. She had endured years of hatred and criticism because she believed that love would eventually triumph, that patience and dignity would eventually win the day. And they had, in a way. She had become queen consort, had finally achieved the recognition she had dreamed of. But the cost was proving to be higher than she had ever imagined. The crown that had seemed like such a prize was beginning to feel like a cage, and the palace that should have been her sanctuary was becoming her prison. She was Queen of England, but she was losing her family. She had won the ultimate prize, but she was paying the ultimate price. As she stood at the window, watching the world wake up beyond the palace walls, Camilla realized that she was facing the most difficult decision of her life. She could accept Charles's edict, cut ties with her family, and embrace her role as queen consort with no distractions or complications. Or she could fight for the people she loved, risking everything she had worked for decades to achieve. The letter on her desk seemed to pulse with significance, waiting for her response. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside these walls, a woman was struggling with a choice that would define not only her future, but the future of the monarchy itself. The morning fog was lifting, but for Camilla Parker Bowles, the darkest hour was just beginning. She turned away from the window and walked back to her desk, her fingers hovering over the telephone. She needed to call Tom, to warn him about what was coming. She needed to speak to Laura, to prepare her for the storm that was about to break over their heads. Most of all, she needed to find Charles and demand an explanation, to look him in the eye and ask him how he could do this to her, to them, to the family that had sacrificed everything for his love. But first, she needed to decide who she was going to be in this moment. Was she Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who had fought for love against impossible odds? Or was she Queen Consort Camilla, who understood that duty must always come before desire? The choice would define not only her response to this crisis, but who she would become in the years to follow. The throne room at Buckingham Palace had witnessed countless moments of history, but none quite like the confrontation that was about to unfold. Camilla had requested an immediate audience with the king, using the formal protocols that now governed even their most private conversations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had to make an appointment to argue with her own husband about the destruction of her family. Charles sat behind his desk, still wearing the morning suit from his earlier meeting with the Commonwealth representatives. His face was drawn, aged beyond his years by the weight of the crown that now defined every aspect of his existence. When Camilla entered, he didn't look up immediately, instead finishing his review of a document that suddenly seemed far more important than acknowledging his wife's presence. "Your Majesty," she said, the formal address dripping with sarcasm and pain. "I believe we need to discuss your recent correspondence." Charles finally raised his eyes, and, for a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But it was quickly replaced by the measured expression he had perfected since becoming king: neutral, diplomatic, emotionally distant. It was a look she had grown to despise because it meant he was about to hurt her in the name of duty. "Camilla, please sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I know this is difficult." Difficult. The word came out as a sharp laugh that echoed off the ornate walls. "Charles, you're destroying my family. You're asking me to choose between the people I love and the crown I helped you win. Difficult doesn't begin to cover what this is." She remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. The letter that had shattered her morning was now crumpled in her purse, but every word was burned into her memory. The formal language couldn't disguise the brutality of what he was asking her to do. Charles stood as well, moving around the desk toward her, but she stepped back. The physical distance between them felt symbolic of something much larger that was breaking apart in real time. This wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about who they were as a couple, what their marriage meant, and whether love could survive the crushing weight of royal responsibility. "The advisors are unanimous," Charles began, his voice taking on the rehearsed quality she had learned to dread. "The Parker Bowles connection has become a liability we can no longer afford. Every scandal, every misstep, every photograph gets traced back to the crown. The institution cannot survive continued damage to its reputation." "The institution," Camilla repeated, her voice rising. "What about our marriage, Charles? What about the vows we made? What about the promises you whispered to me during all those years when we were fighting the world together?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of decades of shared struggle. They had weathered so much together. The initial scandal, Diana's death, and the aftermath, the long, slow climb back to public acceptance. Through it all, they had been a team, united against a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. "You know how much I love you," Charles said, and for the first time that morning, his voice cracked slightly. "But I'm king now. That changes everything. The responsibilities, the obligations, they're not just mine anymore. They're ours. And part of that responsibility is protecting the monarchy from anything that might damage it, even if what might damage it is my family." Camilla's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it carried more power than any shout could have. "These are the people who stood by me when the entire country hated me. Tom and Laura were children when our affair became public, Charles. Children. They endured years of abuse, of being followed by photographers, of having their every move scrutinized because they were connected to me. And they never complained, not once." She moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where tourists were already gathering for the changing of the guard. Normal people living normal lives, unaware of the family drama playing out in the rooms above their heads. How many of them would understand the choice she was being asked to make? How many would believe that love could demand such a sacrifice? "Tom almost dropped out of university because of the pressure," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she remembered the pain her children had endured. "Laura stopped dating for 2 years because every boy she met was either scared off by the publicity or only interested in her because of her connection to us. Mark had his business threatened by boycotts. My entire family paid a price for our love, and they paid it willingly because they believed in us." Charles had moved closer, close enough that she could see the genuine anguish in his eyes. This wasn't easy for him either, she realized. But that knowledge didn't make the betrayal any less painful. "Do you remember what you told me during the Camillagate scandal?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "When those awful recordings were published, and the whole world heard our most private conversations. You said that we would face whatever came together as a team. You said that nothing could break us apart because we had already survived the worst." "That was before," Charles said quietly. "Before I became king. Before the responsibilities became so enormous that personal desires had to be set aside for the greater good." "The greater good," Camilla repeated bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like cowardice." It looks like you're sacrificing the people who loved us when no one else would in order to appease advisors who care more about opinion polls than about human decency. The accusation hit its mark, and Charles's royal composure finally cracked. You think this is easy for me? He snapped, his voice rising to match hers. You think I want to do this? Every fiber of my being is screaming against it. But I don't have the luxury of following my heart anymore. I have an entire nation to think about, a commonwealth to consider, 1,000 years of history that I'm responsible for preserving. And what about the woman who helped you preserve it? Camilla shot back. What about the wife who stood beside you through every crisis, every scandal, every moment when it would have been easier to walk away? What about the family that endured hatred and persecution because they loved me and I loved you? The room fell silent except for the ticking of the enormous grandfather clock that had marked time for generations of monarchs. Both of them were breathing hard, emotionally exhausted by a conversation that felt like it was tearing apart not just their marriage but their very identities. Charles moved to his desk and picked up another document. Official papers that Camilla now realized contained the details of how her family's exclusion would be implemented. The guest lists that would be revised, the invitations that would no longer be sent, the quiet but thorough erasure of the Parker Bowles name from royal life. There's something else, he said, his voice now barely audible. The advisors want you to make a public statement supporting the decision. They want it to appear that this was a mutual choice, that you understand the necessity of maintaining appropriate distance between your family and royal duties. The request hit Camilla like a physical blow. They didn't just want her to abandon her family. They wanted her to publicly betray them, to stand before the world and declare that she was choosing the crown over the people she loved. It was the ultimate humiliation, the final test of her loyalty to the institution that had demanded so much from her over the years. They want me to lie, she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. They want me to pretend that cutting my family out of my life was my idea. Charles couldn't meet her eyes. It would make the transition easier. Less questions from the press, less speculation about divisions within the royal family. Less truth, you mean? Camilla sank into the chair she had refused earlier, suddenly, feeling every one of her years. Charles, if I do this, if I make that statement, there's no going back. My family will never forgive me, and honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever forgive myself. But you'll be queen consort without any complications, Charles said, though his words sounded hollow even to him. You'll be able to focus entirely on your royal duties, on supporting me as king, on building the legacy we've always talked about. What legacy? Camilla looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. What kind of legacy are we building if it's constructed on the graves of the relationships that sustained us through the darkest times? What kind of queen will I be if I achieve the position by betraying the people who loved me unconditionally? Charles had no answer, and his silence was perhaps more devastating than any words could have been. They both knew that once this line was crossed, once she made that public statement, their marriage would become something entirely different. It would be a partnership of convenience, a business arrangement between two people who had once shared the deepest love, but had sacrificed it on the altar of royal duty. Outside, the changing of the guard was beginning, and they could hear the distant sound of military bands playing. It seemed fitting somehow, one guard being replaced by another, old loyalties being discarded in favor of new obligations. But, unlike the ceremonial guards, some changes couldn't be undone with a simple rotation. Camilla stood up slowly, feeling as though she was moving through water. Everything seemed surreal, suspended in a moment that would define the rest of her life. In one direction lay her family, her past, her identity as a woman who had fought for love against impossible odds. In the other direction lay the crown, the future, her role as queen consort in a monarchy that demanded absolute loyalty. I need time, she said finally. Time to think, time to figure out how to live with whatever choice I make. How much time? Charles asked, and she could hear the pressure in his voice. The palace machine was waiting for her decision, preparing for whatever announcement would come. I don't know, she admitted. But I need you to understand something, Charles. Whatever I decide, whatever statement I make or don't make, this conversation has changed us forever. The man I married would never have asked me to choose between him and my family. The king sitting before me just did. I need to figure out which one of you I'm really married to. She walked toward the door, each step feeling like a small death. Behind her, she could hear Charles calling her name, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see whether it was her husband or the king who was asking her to stay. The private apartments at Clarence House had never felt more like a prison than they did that afternoon. Camilla sat in the conservatory where she had once entertained her grandchildren, surrounded by the ghosts of family gatherings that would never happen again. The silence was deafening, broken only by the persistent ringing of her phone as reporters tried to reach her for comment on rumors that were already beginning to circulate. She had turned off her mobile after the 15th call from tabloid journalists who somehow sensed that something significant was happening behind palace walls. The palace press office had issued a standard no-comment response, but that had only intensified speculation. Social media was already buzzing with theories about a rift between the king and queen consort, and photographers were gathering outside the gates like storm clouds on the horizon. The afternoon mail had brought a stack of letters that her private secretary had marked as urgent. Invitations to upcoming royal events that would need to be declined if she chose her family. Charitable patronages that would have to be reconsidered. Official photographs that would need to be retaken if certain family members could no longer appear alongside her. The machinery of royalty was already adjusting to accommodate her potential decision, and seeing it laid out so clinically made everything feel even more real and devastating. But it was the personal cost that was truly breaking her heart. She thought about her grandson Louis, just 5 years old, who had only recently started understanding that his grandmother was someone special. He loved coming to the palace for tea, loved the way the guards saluted him, loved the stories she told him about the history contained in every room. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that he couldn't visit anymore because his presence was politically inconvenient? Her daughter Laura had called 3 times, increasingly frantic voicemails that Camilla couldn't bring herself to return. Laura was planning her own wedding for next spring, and they had spent hours discussing whether it should be a small family affair or a larger celebration befitting the daughter of the queen consort. Now it seemed that Camilla might not be able to attend at all without creating a constitutional crisis. The absurdity of it all was almost overwhelming. She was being asked to choose between attending her daughter's wedding and maintaining the dignity of the crown. 30 years ago, when she was just another divorcee having an affair with the Prince of Wales, such a choice would have been unimaginable. Now it was not just possible, but necessary, according to the constitutional experts who had taken over her life. Tom had been characteristically direct in his response to the news. He had driven straight to Clarence House, demanding to see his mother and get answers about what was happening to their family. Her security team had turned him away at the gate, following new protocols that had apparently been put in place overnight. Watching her own son being refused entry to her home had been one of the most painful moments of a day filled with them. The staff were walking on eggshells around her, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact. They had all seen the official memos about security protocols and guest restrictions, and they understood what was happening even if no one was brave enough to discuss it openly. Some of them had worked for the Parker Bowles family for years, had watched Tom and Laura grow up, had celebrated family milestones, and shared in both joys and sorrows. Now they were being asked to treat these same people as unwelcome strangers. As evening approached, Camilla found herself standing in her bedroom, looking at the photographs that covered her dressing table. Images from happier times when the future seemed full of possibility rather than impossible choices. There was a picture from Charles's coronation, with her looking radiant in her crown and robes, finally, achieving the recognition she had dreamed of for decades. Beside it was a photo from Laura's university graduation, the whole family beaming with pride and love. The contrast between those two images seemed to sum up her entire dilemma. She could have the crown, or she could have her family, but, apparently, she could not have both. The woman in the coronation photo looked triumphant, vindicated after years of struggle and sacrifice. The woman in the family photo looked genuinely happy, surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. The question was which woman she wanted to be for the rest of her life. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and her private secretary entered with yet another urgent message. The Archbishop of Canterbury was requesting a meeting to discuss the current situation and its implications for upcoming religious ceremonies. The Prime Minister's office had called twice to express concern about potential constitutional complications. Most painfully, Diana's brother Earl Spencer had released a statement to the press expressing his support for Camilla's family, which somehow made everything feel even more complicated and emotionally fraught. "Ma'am," her secretary said gently, "His Majesty has requested your presence for dinner. He's waiting in the private dining room." Camilla almost laughed at the formality of it all. Her husband was requesting her presence for dinner as though they were diplomatic officials from different countries rather than two people who had shared a bed for decades. But she supposed that was what they had become now, representatives of competing interests who happened to live in the same palace. The walk to the dining room felt endless, each step taking her deeper into a conversation she wasn't sure she was ready to have. Charles was already seated when she arrived, still in his formal day clothes, but looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. The table was set with their finest china and crystal, as though the elegant surroundings could somehow make the upcoming discussion more civilized. "Have you made your decision?" he asked without preamble as she took her seat across from him. The directness of the question was almost brutal in its simplicity. "Is that really how we're going to start this conversation?" Camilla replied, unfolding her napkin with deliberate care. "No pleasantries, no asking about my day, no acknowledgement of the impossible position you've put me in." Charles sighed deeply, and, for a moment, she saw past the royal facade to the man who was struggling with this decision as much as she was. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This isn't how I wanted this to go. But the pressure is immense, Camilla. Every hour that passes without a resolution makes the situation more difficult to manage." "Manage," she repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what our marriage has become? Something to be managed rather than cherished?" Before he could answer, the first course was served by staff who moved like shadows, desperate not to intrude on a conversation that was clearly tearing apart the very foundations of their employment. The soup sat untouched between them as they stared at each other across a table that might as well have been an ocean. "I've been thinking about Diana," Camilla said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. About what she went through when she realized that being royal meant sacrificing everything that made life worth living. The loneliness, the isolation, the way the institution consumed everything genuine and human about her existence. Charles flinched at the mention of his first wife, but Camilla pressed on. She tried to find ways to remain connected to real life, real people, real emotions. And look what happened to her. The palace never forgave her for refusing to disappear into the role they had written for her. "That's not fair," Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Camilla leaned forward, her eyes intense with sudden understanding. "Diana died because she was trying to escape the prison of royal life, trying to find some authentic human connection in a world that demanded she be a symbol rather than a person. And now you're asking me to walk willingly into that same prison, to cut away every authentic relationship in my life in order to become the perfect royal wife." The comparison hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and undeniably accurate. Both women had loved the same man, but the institution that surrounded him had proven toxic to human relationships, demanding sacrifices that no normal person should have to make. "The difference is that you chose this," Charles said finally. "You knew what you were getting into when you married me." "Did I?" Camilla's voice rose slightly. "I thought I was marrying a man who had learned from his first marriage, who understood the cost of putting duty before love. I thought we were building something different, something that honored both our responsibilities and our humanity." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the gardens where they had walked in happier times. "But you're asking me to become exactly what Diana refused to be, a silent, compliant figurehead who smiles for the cameras and never causes any inconvenience to the people who really run this country. I'm asking you to understand that being queen consort requires sacrifices," Charles replied. But even he seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded. "No." Camilla turned to face him, and her voice was steady now, filled with a new kind of resolve. "You're asking me to sacrifice my soul. You're asking me to look my children in the eye and tell them that a crown is more important than the love that sustained me through the darkest period of my life. You're asking me to betray every value that made you fall in love with me in the first place." The dinner continued in painful silence, both of them picking at their food while avoiding each other's eyes. Outside, London continued its evening rhythm, but inside the palace walls, time seemed suspended in a moment of decision that would reshape not just their marriage but their understanding of what love meant when it collided with power. Finally, Charles spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if there was another way? What if we could find some middle ground that satisfied both the constitutional requirements and your need to maintain family relationships?" For a moment, hope flickered in Camilla's chest. What kind of middle ground? Limited contact, carefully managed appearances, family gatherings that happen away from royal residences, with strict media protocols. Even as he said the words, Charles seemed to realize how inadequate they sounded. "You're talking about turning my family relationships into publicity stunts," Camilla said slowly. "Scheduled, managed encounters that serve the palace's needs rather than genuine human connection. It's better than cutting them off completely." "Is it?" Camilla stood up again, this time walking toward the door. "Charles, if you can't understand why that would be worse than an honest separation, then you've already been consumed by this institution more completely than I realized." She paused at the doorway, looking back at the man she had loved for most of her adult life. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning. But I want you to think about something tonight. If you succeed in turning me into the perfect royal wife, will you still love the woman I become? Or will you spend the rest of your reign mourning the authentic person you destroyed in order to create her?" The question echoed in the formal dining room as she left, and Charles sat alone among the crystal and china, wondering if winning this battle would mean losing everything that had ever truly mattered to him. Dawn broke over London with an unusual clarity, as if the sky itself was preparing to witness history in the making. Camilla had not slept more than an hour, spending the night walking through the empty corridors of Clarence House, past portraits of long-dead royals who had faced their own impossible choices between personal desire and public duty. Each painting seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as though they understood the weight of the decision she was about to make. The morning newspapers had arrived with headlines that made her stomach turn. "Royal Rift. Queen Consort's family banned from palace," screamed across the front page of the Sun. The Daily Mail featured unflattering photographs of Tom leaving a London restaurant with friends, accompanied by speculation about his embarrassing behavior. The Times took a more measured approach, but still managed to convey the constitutional crisis that was brewing behind palace walls. Her breakfast sat untouched as she read through the coverage, each article driving home the reality that this was no longer a private family matter. The entire world was watching, waiting to see whether love or duty would triumph in the House of Windsor. Social media was ablaze with opinions from people who had never faced such an impossible choice, but felt qualified to judge her regardless. The most painful article was in The Guardian, which had somehow obtained quotes from several of her charitable patronages expressing concern about her ability to fulfill her duties while managing family distractions. These were organizations she had worked with for years, causes she genuinely cared about, and now they were politely distancing themselves from her because of circumstances beyond her control. At 9 o'clock sharp, her private secretary knocked and entered with a message that made her heart race. "Ma'am, your son Tom is at the main gate. He's requesting to see you urgently, and there are photographers present. Security is asking for instructions on how to proceed." Camilla closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her golden cage closing in around her. Even a conversation with her own son had become a potential public relations disaster. "Tell security to let him through the back entrance. No photographers, and I want him escorted directly to my private study." 10 minutes later, Tom Parker Bowles stood in her doorway looking haggard and worried. At 48, he still resembled the little boy she had protected through the worst years of public hatred. But now there were lines around his eyes that spoke of his own struggles with the burden of being her son. "Mom, what the hell is happening?" he asked without preamble, crossing the room to embrace her. "Laura called me hysterical last night saying she'd been disinvited from some royal event, and the press is camped outside my restaurant asking if I'm being banished from the family." Camilla held her son tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and remembering all the times she had comforted him when the world seemed too cruel and complicated to bear. "Sit down, darling. We need to talk." She explained the situation as gently as she could, watching Tom's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and, finally, a resigned understanding that was perhaps the most heartbreaking reaction of all. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window at the gardens where he had played as a child during weekend visits. "So Charles wants us gone," he said finally. "After everything we've been through, after all the years of standing by you both, he's decided we're not worth the trouble anymore." "It's not that simple," Camilla began, but Tom held up a hand to stop her. "Actually, it is that simple, Mom. Either we're family or we're not. Either our relationship matters or it doesn't. There's no middle ground here, no compromise that preserves everyone's dignity." He turned to look at her directly, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The question is what you're going to do about it." "I don't know," she admitted. "If I choose you and Laura, I lose everything I've worked for decades to achieve. If I choose the crown, I lose the people who love me most in the world." Tom was quiet for another moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote this last night after Laura called. I was going to give it to the press, but I wanted to talk to you first. Camilla unfolded the paper and read her son's handwritten statement. It was elegant, dignified, and heartbreaking in its simplicity. Tom was offering to voluntarily distance himself from royal life to protect both his mother and the monarchy. He would take full responsibility for any embarrassment his family had caused, would publicly support Camilla's role as queen consort, and would ensure that the Parker Bowles name never again became a source of controversy for the crown. "You can't do this," Camilla whispered, tears finally beginning to fall. "You can't sacrifice yourself to solve a problem you didn't create." "Why not?" Tom asked with a sad smile. "You've been sacrificing yourself for other people's problems your entire adult life. You endured decades of hatred because you loved Charles. You gave up your privacy, your peace, your ability to live a normal life because you believed in a future where love might finally win. Maybe it's time for me to return the favor." The generosity of his offer was overwhelming, but it also crystallized something important for Camilla. If she allowed her son to fall on his sword to protect her position, she would be betraying every principle that had sustained her through the difficult years. She would be choosing institutional power over human love, exactly the kind of choice that had destroyed so many royal marriages before hers. "No," she said firmly, handing the statement back to him. "If anyone is going to make a sacrifice here, it should be me. I'm the one who chose this life, who pursued this position despite knowing the cost. You and Laura were children when this all began. You never asked to be part of this drama, but you supported me anyway. I won't let you pay the price for my choices now." Tom looked surprised by the strength in her voice. "Mom, you've wanted to be queen consort since I was a boy. You've weathered every storm, every scandal, every cruel headline because you believed this day would come. Are you really going to throw it all away now?" "Maybe," Camilla said, and the word felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. "Maybe the crown isn't worth having if the cost is losing my soul." Before Tom could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Charles's private secretary, looking uncomfortable and formal. "Your Majesty, His Majesty requests your presence in his study. He says it's urgent." Camilla looked at her son, then back at the secretary. "Tell His Majesty that I'll be along shortly. And please arrange for my son to be escorted out through the back and trance again." After Tom left with promises to call Laura and prepare her for whatever decision their mother was about to make, Camilla spent 20 minutes preparing herself for what she knew would be the most important conversation of her life. She dressed carefully in a navy suit that made her feel strong and professional, pinned on the brooch Charles had given her for their first anniversary, and practiced what she was going to say. The walk to Charles's study felt like a funeral march, each step taking her closer to a moment that would define the rest of her life. Staff members she passed in the corridors avoided eye contact, as though they sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold and didn't want to be witnesses to the disintegration of a royal marriage. Charles was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her as he looked out at the courtyard where tourists were already beginning to gather for the morning tours. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of decisions that were proving too heavy for even a king to bear gracefully. "The press coverage is getting worse," he said without turning around. "My private secretary says we need to announce your decision within the hour or risk losing control of the narrative entirely. Then you'll have your answer," Camilla said quietly. "But I want you to understand what it means." Charles finally turned to face her, and she could see that he had slept as little as she had. His eyes were bloodshot, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled, and there was a tremor in his hands that spoke of the enormous stress he was under. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he began. "About Diana, about the choices that destroyed her, about what kind of marriage we want to have. Maybe there's still a way to find some compromise that preserves both our family and the monarchy." For a moment, hope flickered in Camilla's chest, but then she saw the official documents scattered across his desk and realized that the machinery of royal protocol was already in motion. Whatever compromise he was imagining, it would still involve managing her family rather than simply accepting them. "Charles," she said gently, "there are some things that can't be compromised. Love is one of them. Either you trust me enough to let my family remain part of my life, or you don't. Either our marriage is strong enough to weather whatever storms my imperfect relatives might create, or it isn't." "It's not about trust," Charles protested. "It's about reality. The monarchy exists on public confidence, and that confidence is fragile. One more scandal, one more embarrassing headline, and decades of work to restore the crown's reputation could be undone. So could our marriage, Camilla replied. If you force me to choose between you and my family, I will never forgive you. If you turn me into a woman who abandons the people she loves for political convenience, you will have created someone you can no longer love. Either way, we lose. Charles sank into his chair, suddenly, looking every one of his 75 years. What are you saying? I'm saying that you need to decide what kind of king you want to be, Camilla said, sitting across from him one last time. Do you want to be the king who learned from his first marriage's mistakes, who understood that love and family are worth protecting even when they're inconvenient? Or do you want to be the king who chose political expediency over human decency, who sacrificed the people who loved him most in order to appease advisors who will never care about him the way his family does? The question hung in the air between them, and Camilla realized that her decision had already been made. Not by weighing the pros and cons, not by calculating the costs and benefits, but by listening to the voice inside her that had sustained her through every crisis she had ever faced. She stood up slowly, feeling lighter somehow despite the enormity of what was about to happen. I'm going to make a statement to the press this afternoon. I'm going to tell them that I choose my family, and that any king who would ask me to abandon the people I love is not a man I can continue to support as queen consort. Charles's face went pale. Camilla, if you do that, it will destroy everything we've built together. No, she said sadly. It will reveal what we've built together. The question is whether you'll let it be destroyed, or whether you'll find the courage to rebuild it into something worthy of the love we once shared. She walked to the door, then paused without turning around. I'll always love the man who courted me for 30 years and never gave up believing that our love could overcome any obstacle. But I can't live with the king who thinks that love is a liability to be managed rather than a gift to be treasured. As she left Charles's study for the last time as his queen consort, Camilla felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The return of her authentic self, the woman who had always chosen love over convenience, truth over comfort, and family over everything else that the world might offer in exchange for her soul. The press conference was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the afternoon, giving the palace communications team just enough time to prepare for what would undoubtedly be one of the most significant royal announcements in modern history. Word had leaked that Queen Consort Camilla would be making a personal statement, and by 2:30, every major news outlet in the world had cameras positioned outside Clarence's house. Camilla sat in her private study, reviewing the statement she had written by hand during the morning hours. It was only 2 pages long, but every word had been carefully chosen to convey not just her decision, but her reasons for making it. She had refused all offers from the palace press office to help craft the message, knowing that this needed to be entirely her own voice, unfiltered by the political calculations that had brought them to this moment. Through her window, she could see the gathering crowd of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers who sensed that they were about to witness history. Social media was already buzzing with speculation about what she might say, with hashtags like #CamillaChooses and #RoyalBreaking trending worldwide. The woman who had once been the most hated person in Britain was about to command the attention of the entire globe. At 2:45, her private secretary knocked and entered with a final message. Ma'am, His Majesty has asked me to tell you that if you reconsider your decision in the next 15 minutes, the original arrangement can still be implemented quietly. He says there's still time to find a private solution that avoids a public crisis. Camilla looked up from her statement and smiled sadly. Please tell His Majesty that the time for private solutions ended when he chose institutional convenience over personal loyalty. What happens next is the consequence of that choice. As the secretary left, Camilla stood and walked to her dressing table for one final look in the mirror. She had chosen to wear a simple black dress with the pearl necklace her grandmother had given her when she was 18, something that connected her to her family history rather than her royal status. Her makeup was understated, her hair styled simply, and she wore no crown or tiara. Today she would speak as Camilla Parker Bowles, not as queen consort. The walk to the small press room at Clarence's house felt like the longest journey of her life, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in months, she wasn't calculating the political implications of every gesture, wasn't worrying about how her words might be interpreted by constitutional experts or foreign diplomats. She was simply a woman preparing to tell the truth about an impossible situation. The room fell silent as she entered, the clicking of cameras the only sound as dozens of journalists tried to capture the moment when a queen consort chose love over duty. She took her place behind the small podium, spread her handwritten pages in front of her, and looked directly into the cameras that would carry her words around the world. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I have asked you here today to share a personal decision that will have significant implications for my role as queen consort and for my relationship with the royal family." She paused, glancing down at her notes, then decided to speak from her heart instead of from the carefully crafted text. "For the past several months, I have been asked to choose between my loyalty to the crown and my love for my family. I have been told that my children and grandchildren represent a liability to the monarchy, that their presence in my life creates unnecessary complications for the institution I have served faithfully for decades." The room was absolutely silent, every reporter leaning forward to catch her words. This was unprecedented, a senior member of the royal family publicly criticizing the very institution she represented. "I want to be clear about something," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger. "My family has made mistakes, as all families do. But they have also shown me unconditional love and support through the darkest periods of my life. When the entire country hated me, when the press called me names that I cannot repeat in polite company, when I questioned whether love was worth the price I was being asked to pay for it, my family stood by me." She looked directly into the main camera, knowing that Charles would be watching from somewhere in the palace, probably surrounded by advisors who were calculating the constitutional implications of every word she spoke. "Today I was asked to abandon those people in order to maintain my position as queen consort. I was asked to choose between wearing a crown and loving my children. I was asked to become the kind of person who sacrifices authentic relationships for political convenience." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. "I cannot and will not make that choice. Therefore, effective immediately, I am stepping down from my role as queen consort. I am returning to my life as Camilla Parker Bowles, a private citizen who happens to be married to the King of England, but who will no longer participate in official royal duties or represent the crown in any capacity." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the furious clicking of cameras and the scratch of pens on paper as reporters tried to capture the magnitude of what had just been announced. A queen consort had just abdicated her role, not for scandal, not for health reasons, but for love. "I want to thank the British people for their eventual acceptance of my relationship with King Charles," Camilla continued. "I know that many of you questioned whether someone like me deserved to wear the crown, and perhaps you were right to question it. Perhaps the crown should only be worn by someone who can sacrifice everything else for its sake. I have discovered that I am not that person." Her voice caught slightly as she reached the most personal part of her statement. "To my husband, I want to say that I will always love the man who waited 30 years for me, who never gave up believing that our love could overcome any obstacle. But I cannot live with the king who believes that love is a weakness to be managed rather than a strength to be celebrated. If that makes me unworthy of being queen consort, then so be it." She folded her notes, though she had barely looked at them, and prepared to leave the podium. But then she decided there was one more thing that needed to be said. "To young people who might be watching this, I want you to understand something important. There will be times in your life when you are asked to choose between being successful and being authentic, between achieving your dreams and staying true to your values. The world will tell you that compromise is always possible, that you can find a way to have everything you want without sacrificing anything you love." She smiled sadly, thinking about the naive woman she had been just days earlier, believing that she could balance crown and family, duty and love, without losing any part of herself in the process. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes life demands that you choose what matters most to you, and then you have to live with the consequences of that choice. Today I chose love, family, and authenticity over power, position, and prestige. History will judge whether I made the right decision, but I am at peace with it. Without taking questions, without acknowledging the shouted inquiries from dozens of reporters, Camilla walked away from the podium and out of the room. Behind her, she left chaos, reporters frantically calling their editors, photographers rushing to capture images of the empty podium, political commentators already beginning to analyze the constitutional implications of what had just occurred. But Camilla felt only relief as she walked back through the corridors of Clarence's house for what might be the last time. Her phone was already ringing with calls from family members who had been watching the press conference, and She could hear Tom's voice calling her name as he ran through the front door, having pushed past security in his excitement to reach her. "Mom, that was incredible," he said, sweeping her into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "I can't believe you actually did it. I can't believe you chose us." "Of course I chose you," Camilla replied, holding her son tightly. "How could I do anything else?" Laura arrived 20 minutes later, tears streaming down her face as she embraced the mother who had given up a crown for love. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Are you sure you won't regret it?" "The only thing I regret," Camilla said firmly, "is that it took me so long to realize what really mattered. I spent so many years fighting for a position that I thought would validate my life, prove that I was worthy of love and respect. But the crown can't give you those things. Only authentic relationships can." By evening, the story was dominating headlines around the world. "Queen consort chooses love over crown," declared the Times. "The queen who wouldn't compromise," announced The Guardian. International news outlets were calling it the most significant royal crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936. Constitutional experts were debating the implications of an unprecedented situation. Could Camilla remain married to the king while refusing to serve as queen consort? What did this mean for the monarchy's stability? How would Charles continue as king without the support of his wife? But Camilla wasn't watching the news coverage or reading the analysis. She was sitting in her conservatory with Tom and Laura, sharing tea and stories and laughter for the first time in months without worrying about who might be listening or how their conversation might be interpreted by palace protocol officers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Charles. Just 4 words, "I understand. I'm sorry." She stared at the message for a long time, wondering if it represented the beginning of a conversation that might heal their relationship or simply the final acknowledgement that they had chosen different paths. As night fell over London, Camilla stood once again at her window, looking out at a city that was probably still buzzing with discussion about her decision. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations about her future living arrangements, complex negotiations about her relationship with Charles, and her place in royal family events. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. She was no longer Queen Consort Camilla, bound by protocols and expectations that demanded she sacrifice her humanity for her position. She was simply Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman who had loved completely, chosen courageously, and discovered that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to walk away. Her grandchildren would visit again. Her son would no longer be turned away at palace gates. Her daughter's wedding would be a celebration of family rather than a constitutional crisis. The crown was gone, but everything that had made her life worth living remained. Outside her window, London slept, unaware that in choosing love over duty, Camilla Parker Bowles had perhaps saved not just her family, but her own soul. And maybe, just maybe, she had also shown a future generation that some things are too precious to sacrifice, no matter what the world might offer in exchange.